Welcome back to part 2 of lecture 2. Let's look now at meaningful lives. So, meaningful life. Well, what's a meaningful life? Well, for drawing from the meaningless lives, we can see that it's one that is actively and at least somewhat successfully engaged in projects of positive value, right? So Woolf, not in the reading that you read, but in a related, in her book on the meaning of life, she describes her view as saying that meaningfulness arises when you get subjective attraction meeting objective attractiveness. So roughly what we said earlier on is it has to have that subjective feeling of fulfillment, or that feeling of fulfillment from the first person perspective, but the things that fulfill you have to genuinely merit fulfillment. So it has to be meaningful for you and really be meaningful. So something we covered a little bit in lecture 1 as well is that meaningful lives are not necessarily happy lives. They're not necessarily morally virtuous lives, and they don't necessarily need to make the world a better place. I mean, for example, Woolf uses the Paul Gauguin as an example of somebody with a meaningful life. But if you remember section 2, lecture 4 on regret, he wasn't a very morally virtuous person. In terms of morality, he didn't make the world a better place. In terms of art, people like Williams and Woolf think he did. So he gets some of that. But a meaningful life in general doesn't have to have all these components. You can still have meaningfulness without moral virtue, without making the world a better place, and without being happy. It could be very, very sad. Tortured artists are often very, very sad, and yet are often held up as having meaningful lives. So even though meaning isn't related to happiness in a kind of ordinary sense of the term, we still want meaning in our lives, that people are still drawn towards meaning. I think some people like the idea of having meaning in their life because it will make them feel happy. But there still seems to be something attractive about the idea of having meaningfulness, even if it never really brings about happiness. In fact, people are often willing to put their happiness on the line to get meaningfulness. Think of, for example, people who, do charity work. You might be a doctor who wants to get a lot of meaning, and you join medicines. I can't remember the name of it. Médecins Sans Frontières. The medical organization where you go into like other countries and you go and help people. You might be putting your life at risk by going to war zones or dangerous places, and yet making yourself very unhappy doing that, but yet get a sense of meaning. And you might get some sense of contentment out of that, but you're not going to be actively happy from moment to moment. Many people start off with these seemingly happy lives and then go off and do something radical because they really want to bring some meaning to their life. So why seek a meaningful life? I mean, here, just remember the challenges from lecture 1. Why is it that meaningfulness is so important? Well, there's so many reasons that your life might seem meaningless. And one of them we saw is that, you might not have existed because, you're not so special that you had to exist. There's nothing about the world that was such that you necessarily needed to exist. So you're not special. And likewise, you're a small little speck on another small little speck. Even you're a small speck on a slightly bigger speck in a huge, huge universe. So you're not special, and you might think that nothing you can do can have any real meaning. But because we're such small specks, people try and do things that they think will have some purpose, will have some meaning, have some importance. The thought here is that meaningfulness is important because it's actually in your own self-interest. Even if it doesn't make you happy, doesn't make you morally virtuous, you still get something important, like something important that makes life worth living in a way, something that gives you reason to keep going. But here you might think, well, can I not get all of that without pursuing objectively worthwhile things? Can I not just count the hairs in my head if that makes me happy, or glue matchsticks together until they fill a room? Is that not good enough if that makes me happy? Well, Woolf here goes on the offensive and says, look, a life devoted to wholly subjective value would be practically solipsistic. Now, recall that we talked about solipsism very briefly in lecture 1. So solipsism is the view that only your mind exists. And so you might think, if you're a solipsist, you think only you exist. Now, Woolf isn't saying that some creature like Blob, or the trust fund party girl, or the hedge fund manager, or the obsessed pig farmer, or don't believe that other minds exist. But she thinks that those many of these activities that are just about subjective value are practically solipsistic. You end up being so focused on something that's so either not related to people or not done for its own sake, that in effect, you're treating people as if they're only you exist. It's only you that's important. Only what you think is good is important. And really, you should be looking for things that are objectively worthwhile. Things, if they're objectively worthwhile, they should be important to everyone. So she thinks that indifference to the well-being of others constitutes failure to recognize their well-being is really real. If you're only focused on things that are wholly subjectively valued, you're just focused on yourself. It's self-centered or frivolous to care only about subjective value if objective value is real. You really should be trying to look for something bigger than yourself, things which are objectively important, because otherwise you're just not treating people with the regard they're due, is Woolf's thought. And Woolf thinks, we might be small specks on a slightly bigger speck in a huge, potentially empty universe that cares nothing about us. But it's not the case that the universe lacks values or things which are meaningful. We might be very small, and there might be a sense in which there's no purpose to human life in general, but we can still do things of value, Woolf thinks. There's no reason to think that's not the case. We don't have to be practical solipsists. We don't have to. There are things of objective value. And she uses her cases of meaningful lives in an attempt to show this. But other ways to think about it is just to think, well, look, compare rocks and people. Is a person more valuable than a rock? Now, it seems clear that a person is more valuable than a rock. If you have to choose whether to save a person or a rock, you should save a person. You should save, not shave. You should save a person over a rock. Likewise with mosquitoes. People, human beings, are more valuable than mosquitoes. It seems very intuitive that that's objectively true. You should, to save a person's life, use anti-mosquito spray or kill the mosquitoes, because the person is much more valuable than the mosquito. And you also might compare artistic works. So you might compare a Vermeer painting with potato peels. Which is better? Which is the better piece of work? Is there a fact about that? Pardon me. It seems so. It seems that the Vermeer painting is just more aesthetically valuable than the potato peels, and more valuable just in some general sense, because potato peels, what's interesting about that? What's beautiful about that? A Vermeer painting could at least have some aesthetically good qualities and beauty, excellence. Potato peels, and if you've got a choice between picking lint out your navel and setting an Olympic record, it seems that you should set the Olympic record. That just seems objectively more valuable. So it seems that at least there's an intuitive case to be made that there are objective values or activities.